At my husband's funeral, a stranger handed me an envelope that shattered 43 years of lies. The cemetery was almost empty now, just a scattering of fallen leaves dancing across the gravel path as the last of the mourners drifted toward their cars. Margaret Hayes stood by herself, her black dress tugged by the October wind, staring at the freshly covered mound that marked the end of her husband's life. 42 years of marriage lay beneath that soil. And yet as she looked down, she felt like she was saying goodbye to a stranger. She pressed her gloved hand against her stomach, as if steadying herself from an ache that had no clear name. The prayers were over, the condolences given, the awkward hugs exchanged. What lingered was silence, thick and unfamiliar. For decades, her life had been filled with routine, his morning coffee, his well-pressed suits, the predictable rhythm of an architect's schedule. Now there was only stillness. And Margaret felt unsure whether the ache in her chest was grief, relief, or something far more complicated. A voice broke the silence. "Mrs. Hayes," she turned. A man in his early 50s stood a few steps away, sharply dressed in a charcoal suit that looked out of place in this small suburban cemetery. His brown eyes carried a weight of sorrow, or was it unease? She did not recognize him, though he seemed to know her. "I'm sorry to disturb you during such a painful moment," he said, voice soft but urgent. "My name is Anthony Vega. I was a business partner of your husband's." Margaret blinked. The name was faintly familiar, perhaps mentioned once or twice over the years, though Edward, her husband, had always kept his work life firmly walled off from his home. "He liked to protect me from stress," Edward would say whenever she asked too many questions. She had accepted that explanation, telling herself it was an act of love. Yet now, standing face to face with a man who seemed to know far more than she did, she wondered what kind of stress Edward had really been shielding her from. Anthony reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila envelope. He held it with both hands as though it carried something heavy inside. "Edward asked me to give this to you," he said quietly. "Only after his funeral, only when you were alone." Margaret's throat tightened. The envelope bore her name, Margaret Hayes, written in her husband's unmistakable hand. The careful script she had once adored in love letters, the same hand that had signed birthday cards and grocery lists for decades. Her breath caught. "When did he prepare this?" she asked, her voice a whisper. Anthony's face clouded. "Some time ago. He wanted to be sure you received it, and I believe you'll understand why when you open it. I am truly sorry, Mrs. Hayes, for everything." His eyes lingered on her with something close to pity before he turned and walked swiftly toward the parking lot. Margaret was left standing with the envelope pressed against her chest. The October air bit at her cheeks, but it was not the cold that made her tremble. It was the dread. She lowered herself onto a stone bench beside the grave, her hands shaking as she traced the loops of her name across the envelope. She could not bring herself to open it, not yet. Edward had been distant in his final years, retreating into late nights at the office, long business trips, unexplained absences. She had told herself it was the burden of success, the cost of building a respected firm, but the envelope in her hands suggested otherwise. Her daughter Claire had dismissed Margaret's concerns whenever she voiced them. "You're imagining things, Mom. Dad's just tired. You worry too much." Maybe she did worry too much, or maybe she hadn't worried enough. The cemetery was nearly deserted now, but Margaret remained, clutching the envelope like a lifeline. The thought of tearing it open both terrified and compelled her. What if it confirmed every doubt she had buried for years? What if it revealed that her marriage, her very identity as wife and mother, had been built on a lie? She closed her eyes and listened to the wind rustling through the trees. Memories flickered. Edward's warm smile when they bought their first home. His steady arm around her at Claire's graduation, the way he used to whisper, "You're the heart of everything I build." Were those words true, or just part of a performance carefully rehearsed? Slowly, Margaret slid a finger under the seal. The flap resisted, then gave way with a sigh, as if even the paper knew it carried something grave. Inside was not a letter, not yet, but two objects: a brass key tarnished from use, and a slip of paper with an address written in Edward's neat script. Margaret's pulse hammered. The address meant nothing to her. She had lived with Edward in Maplewood Heights for over 4 decades, yet this was not a place she recognized. And the key, old, worn, heavy, seemed to carry a history she could not name. Her hands trembled so violently she nearly dropped it. Closing her fist around the key, she felt the cold metal bite into her palm, anchoring her to the bench. Whatever secrets her husband had kept, they were no longer buried with him. They had been handed to her, waiting to be unlocked. She sat there for what felt like hours, the envelope resting on her lap, the key pressing into her skin. Part of her longed to march straight to the address, demand answers, tear away the veil of mystery Edward had left behind. Another part of her wanted to throw the envelope into the grave, burying the secret with the man who had carried it. But as she rose from the bench, Margaret knew there was no turning back. The key was more than metal, it was a summons. Whatever waited behind that locked door, it was her burden now. The October wind howled through the trees, scattering brittle leaves across the grave. Margaret clutched the key in her pocket and whispered to the earth beneath her feet. "Who were you, Edward, and what else did you hide from me?" She turned toward her car, the envelope still trembling in her grasp, knowing that the life she thought she understood had just slipped beyond recognition. The drive home from the cemetery was slow and heavy, the kind of ride where even the hum of the engine seemed reluctant. Margaret kept the envelope on the passenger seat, her eyes darting to it at every stoplight. The brass key glimmered faintly in the weak autumn sunlight, a small piece of metal that now carried the weight of 42 years of questions. Inside her quiet house, the silence pressed in. For decades, this house had been filled with the sound of Edward's measured footsteps, the clink of his coffee spoon against a porcelain cup, the rustle of blueprints spread across the dining room table. Now, only the tick of the old grandfather clock accompanied her. Margaret sat at the kitchen table, staring at the key and the address. She traced the numbers again and again with her finger, whispering them aloud as if saying them might spark recognition. Nothing came. The address belonged to a different world, one Edward had kept locked away. Her mind spiraled backward. She tried to recall every moment when Edward had been distant, every vague excuse about late meetings or sudden travel. The puzzle pieces were scattered through the years, but she had never dared to arrange them. To do so would have been to question the foundation of her marriage, and questioning had felt dangerous. Margaret closed her eyes and allowed herself to drift back to the early days when doubt seemed impossible. She remembered their first apartment, 2 small rooms above a bakery that smelled perpetually of warm bread. Edward had carried her over the threshold with the easy strength of a man certain about his future. They had eaten dinner on the floor that first night. Chinese takeout, cartons balanced on their knees, laughing about how quickly they'd spent the wedding money. He had promised her then that she would never need to worry about anything. "I'll take care of us," he'd said, kissing her temple. "You just be you, Margaret," and she had believed him. In those years, she had been teaching 2nd grade at Roosevelt Elementary. She adored her students, the sticky-fingered hugs, the clumsy but heartfelt drawings of Mrs. Hayes with bright red smiles. Teaching gave her purpose, a sense of identity beyond the role of wife. But when Claire was born, Edward convinced her to step away. "She needs you at home," he had said, holding their newborn daughter like she was the crown jewel of the universe. "And my firm is growing. I need you to manage our world while I build the future." Margaret had agreed. It had felt noble, even romantic. She wasn't giving up her career. She told herself she was exchanging it for a higher calling, being the foundation of a family. She coordinated schedules, hosted client dinners, and polished Edward's image until it gleamed. Their home became a stage where deals were sealed over her lasagna and where Claire's piano recitals provided the soundtrack of upward mobility. For years, it seemed to work. Edward praised her often, at least in private. "You're the heart of everything, Maggie," he would murmur, brushing his lips across her forehead. And Claire would beam at friends and say, "Dad builds the buildings, but Mom builds the life." Those words had once filled Margaret with pride, but somewhere along the way the pride shifted into something more fragile. She began to feel invisible in her own story. Margaret remembered one evening, years before Edward's death, when she had suggested returning to teaching. Claire was in law school by then, and Margaret's days felt hollow once the household chores were complete. She missed the joy of children's laughter, the challenge of shaping young minds. They had been sitting at their favorite Italian restaurant, celebrating Claire's acceptance into a prestigious internship. Margaret had carefully broached the subject, her voice tentative but hopeful. "I've been thinking," she had said. "Roosevelt is looking for substitutes. Maybe I could try a few days a week." The silence that followed still burned in her memory. Edward had laughed lightly, shaking his head. Claire had joined in, her tone gentle but dismissive. "Mom, you've been out of the classroom for 20 years. Things have changed. Technology, curriculum, you'd be setting yourself up for disappointment." Edward's words cut deepest. "Sweetheart, you already have a fulfilling role. Why complicate things with unrealistic fantasies?" Margaret had forced a smile and changed the subject, but inside she had felt a part of herself crumble. That was the first time she realized her dreams no longer belonged in their world. And so she shrank little by little until even her presence seemed optional. At dinners, she would offer an opinion about current events, only to be brushed aside by Edward's practiced authority or Claire's sharp legal mind. When she suggested vacations, they were too busy. When she asked about finances, Edward would pat her hand and say, "Don't trouble yourself." Margaret's thoughts returned to the present. She opened her eyes to the quiet kitchen, the same table where those conversations had happened. How many times had she sat here invisible while Edward and Claire discussed important matters without her? The brass key lay in front of her, daring her to believe she hadn't been imagining it all, that Edward had been living a double life. Her heart pounded. What if the key opened a door to more pain, to another woman, to secrets she couldn't bear? But then again, hadn't she already been living with pain, dulled only by denial? Margaret pressed the key to her lips, the metal cold and foreign. She thought of her sister Louise, who had once warned her not to lose herself in Edward's shadow. "You're more than someone's wife," Louise had said. Margaret hadn't listened then, but now, with Edward gone and the key in her palm, she wished she had. She folded the paper with the address and slid it into her purse. The decision wasn't fully formed, but the seed was planted. She would go there. Not tonight, but soon. She needed to see with her own eyes what Edward had left behind. As she rose from the table, Margaret caught her reflection in the kitchen window. A woman of 67 with silver in her hair, shoulders stooped more from years of dismissal than from age. But her eyes, for the first time in years, carried a spark, not just grief, not just fear, something harder, sharper, resolve. Whatever Edward had hidden, she would face it. Because for the first time in decades, Margaret realized she deserved to know the truth. Margaret woke before dawn the next morning, her sleep broken by dreams that felt more like warnings. She had tossed and turned for hours, replaying Edward's voice in her memory. Sometimes tender, sometimes dismissive, always elusive. The key rested on her nightstand, catching the faint light from the street lamp outside. It seemed to glow in the dark, like a beacon daring her to follow where it led. She rose quietly, almost ritualistically, and made herself a cup of coffee. The routine felt familiar, measuring grounds, listening to the drip, pouring the steaming liquid into her favorite porcelain mug, but everything else felt foreign. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at the paper with the strange address written in Edward's careful script. 1247 Ashbury Lane. It wasn't a place she knew. The numbers and letters looked ordinary enough, yet they seemed to whisper to her, "Come and see what he hid." Margaret hesitated. She wasn't reckless. She had always lived cautiously, following Edward's lead, keeping to the path of what was expected. But something inside her had shifted the moment she saw her name scrawled across that envelope. She was no longer satisfied with silence. By late morning, she made her decision. She put on her coat, tucked the brass key and the slip of paper into her purse, and drove across town. The streets grew unfamiliar as she left behind the manicured lawns of Maplewood Heights and entered an older neighborhood with modest apartment buildings and narrow streets lined with weathered trees. Her hands tightened on the steering wheel when she spotted it, a two-story brick complex with 6 small units, neat but unremarkable. A row of mailboxes stood by the entrance. Margaret's heart nearly stopped when she saw one labeled E. Hayes Unit 2B, her husband's name. Not just written on paper this time, but printed on a mailbox that belonged to a real residence. Her legs trembled as she climbed the stairs. She slid the brass key into the lock of Unit 2B, her breath catching when it turned smoothly with a click. The door opened to a space that smelled faintly of aftershave and coffee. The apartment was fully furnished, not like a secret storage space but like a home. Men's clothes hung neatly in the closet. Shoes lined the mat near the door. On the coffee table sat a pair of reading glasses next to a book she had never seen him read. But what made Margaret sink into the sofa, gasping for breath, were the photographs. Dozens of framed photos filled the shelves and dresser tops. Edward smiled back at her, older but still recognizable, the gray at his temples, the same proud posture. But he was not alone. Beside him in every photo stood a woman with gentle eyes and graying hair. They posed together at restaurants in front of unfamiliar landmarks, celebrating what looked like birthdays and anniversaries Margaret had never known existed. They looked like a couple, not a fling, not a passing shadow, but a life. Margaret's knees gave way. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the evidence of decades of deception. This was not a man who had simply been busy with work. This was a man who had lived an entirely different life, complete with a partner she had never met. She opened the desk drawers with trembling hands. Inside, she found letters tied with ribbon, notes written in handwriting that was not hers. "My dearest Edward," one began, "thank you for another beautiful weekend. I know our situation is complicated, but I treasure the time we share." Her situation, their situation. Margaret's vision blurred with tears as the words cut into her. Edward had built not one but two lives, one where Margaret was the dutiful wife, invisible and compliant, and another where he was free to be affectionate, perhaps even tender with another woman. And then there were the bank statements. Stacks of papers detailed systematic transfers from their joint account into another Edward controlled. Margaret's stomach twisted as she read the amounts. Tens of thousands of dollars moved each year, totaling hundreds of thousands over time. This was how he had funded the apartment, the gifts, the dinners, the vacations. Money she had trusted him to manage. Money meant for their family's security. Her hands shook so violently she dropped one of the envelopes to the. She bent to pick it up and found something she hadn't expected. A sealed letter addressed to her. The date on the front made her gasp. It had been written only 2 weeks before his death. With shaking fingers, she tore it open. My dearest Margaret, if you are reading this, it means Anthony has done as I asked and given you the key. I should have told you myself, but I lacked the courage. I know this discovery will hurt you terribly, and for that I am truly sorry. I was a coward. I lived 2 lives because I could not face the truth of either one. You deserved honesty, and instead I gave you lies. You deserved respect, and instead I gave you dismissal. You deserved a partner, and I gave you a shadow. The words blurred as tears filled her eyes, but she forced herself to continue. I convinced myself that I was protecting you by keeping you out of my work, out of my decisions, out of the truth. But the truth is I was protecting myself from your independence, from your strength, from the possibility that you might outgrow me. You gave me everything, your youth, your loyalty, your care, and I returned only contempt disguised as love. For that I beg your forgiveness, though I know I have no right to it. Margaret dropped the letter into her lap. Her chest felt tight, her breath shallow. She had always suspected she was being diminished, but to see it acknowledged in Edward's own hand, his confession that it had all been deliberate, was both devastating and liberating. For months, she had questioned her own mind, wondering if she was paranoid, imagining the looks, the dismissive comments, the way her presence was treated as unimportant. But here it was, proof in his handwriting that every slight, every dismissal, every cutting remark had been intentional. The shock began to give way to something else, something unfamiliar but fierce. Anger, not the wild rage of youth, but a steady, clarifying fury. Edward had spent 4 decades convincing her she was small, irrelevant, incapable, but she wasn't. She had once been a teacher who inspired children, a woman who held ambitions and dreams. That woman had been buried under years of manipulation, but she was still here. Margaret rose to her feet, letter clenched in her fist. She looked around the apartment, taking in every photo, every item Edward had used to build a life without her. And instead of despair, she felt a strange surge of strength. This was not her failure. This was his. The key had not only unlocked Edward's secret, it had unlocked her anger, her clarity, and perhaps even her path forward. For the first time in decades, Margaret looked in a mirror and did not see a shadow. She saw a woman ready to reclaim what had been stolen from her. The drive back from the apartment felt like traveling through fog. Margaret gripped the steering wheel tightly, the sealed letter heavy in her purse, her heart still pounding from what she had discovered. The streets blurred past her windows, familiar landmarks that suddenly seemed strange, like she was looking at them through someone else's eyes. She had always thought of Maplewood Heights as her sanctuary, the safe cocoon where she had built her life with Edward and raised Claire. But now, she realized it had been nothing more than a carefully staged set. When she finally pulled into her driveway, the sight of her house no longer brought comfort. Instead, it felt like a museum of illusions. The manicured lawn, the colonial-style porch, the white shutters, all of it whispered of a life she thought was real, a life built on promises that had been lies. Inside, the silence was unbearable. She moved through the rooms slowly, almost as if she were visiting someone else's home. The framed photos on the mantel, Edward smiling at company parties, Claire in her graduation gown, the family on vacations she had meticulously planned, all looked staged now, props from a play in which she had been cast as the dutiful wife. Margaret lowered herself onto the living room sofa and let the confession letter spill into her lap once again. She read it a second time, her eyes tracing each cruel line of Edward's words. I diminished you because I feared your independence. I needed you to believe you were dependent on me. Forgive me, though I don't deserve it. Her jaw tightened. She had spent decades internalizing the idea that she wasn't enough, that her dreams were unrealistic, her voice less valuable, her role only supportive. And now, in his own words, Edward had admitted he engineered it that way. The betrayal cut deep, but beneath the wound stirred something else, recognition. She was not imagining things all those years. She had not been paranoid or overly sensitive. She had been silenced strategically, systematically. The realization was both devastating and oddly empowering. For the first time, she could stop doubting herself. The The truth had been written down by the very man who had tried to erase it. Margaret sat upright, her shoulders straighter than they had been in months. She let her gaze travel across the room. Her eyes landed on the old hope chest tucked into the corner of the living room, a relic she hadn't opened in years. Rising slowly, she crossed the room and lifted the lid. Inside lay remnants of her past self, her teaching certificate, letters of recommendation, journals from her 20s filled with ideas for lesson plans and dreams of one day writing children's books. She lifted one of the journals, her fingertips brushing across her younger handwriting. The words seemed alive, full of energy and conviction. She whispered aloud, almost to that younger version of herself, "You were right. You mattered." Her eyes filled with tears, but this time they weren't just tears of grief, they were tears of awakening. Margaret spent the next several hours in that chest, rediscovering pieces of herself she had long forgotten. A yellowing envelope held sketches her students had drawn for her years ago, crayon portraits of Mrs. Hayes, complete with bright sunbursts and wide smiles. One note from a former principal praised her natural ability to ignite curiosity in children. She clutched the letter to her chest, feeling the truth of those words seep back into her bones. For decades, she had allowed Edward's dismissals to convince her she wasn't capable. But the evidence here told a different story. She had been capable once, and she could be again. As evening fell, Margaret's sister Louise called. Her voice, warm and steady, had always been a lifeline. "How are you holding up?" Louise asked. Margaret hesitated. For weeks since the funeral, she had brushed off that question with vague answers. "I'm fine, one day at a time." But tonight, something inside her demanded honesty. "I found something," Margaret said softly. "Edward left me a key. It led to an apartment, another life, another woman, and money he was hiding from us." There was silence on the other end of the line. Then Louise exhaled, a deep, knowing sound. "Oh, Maggie, I always worried there was more to his distance than work. I'm so sorry you had to face this." "I feel like my whole life has been a lie," Margaret admitted. Her voice cracked, but she pressed on. "But at the same time, I feel awake. I've been invisible for so long, Lou, and now I realize it wasn't me, it was him. He wanted me small." Louise's tone sharpened, protective. "He may have wanted that, but you are not small. You are more than what he convinced you to believe. You always were. Maybe now it's time to reclaim that." The words wrapped around Margaret like a quilt. For years, she had accepted Edward's narrative as truth. But now, with her sister's voice steady in her ear, she began to imagine an alternative story, her own. After the call, Margaret returned to the hope chest and carefully placed the teaching certificate on the coffee table. She stared at it for a long while. Her heart beat faster, not with fear but with the thrill of possibility. That night she lay in bed unable to sleep, her mind racing with images of chalkboards and classrooms, of students raising eager hands. Edward's voice echoed, unrealistic fantasies. "Claire's too, you're setting yourself up for disappointment." But another voice, buried deep inside her, spoke louder now. "You were made for more." Margaret realized she stood at a crossroads. She could let Edward's betrayal define the rest of her days, or she could use it as fuel to reclaim the parts of herself she had abandoned. The house creaked in the wind as she stared into the darkness. She clenched her fists, remembering the weight of the brass key in her hand. That key had opened the door to Edward's lies, but perhaps it had also unlocked the path to her liberation. By dawn, her decision was clear. She would no longer be the ghost of Edward Hayes' wife. She would be Margaret again, Margaret the teacher, the thinker, the woman with a voice that mattered. The betrayal had wounded her, yes, but it had also freed her. The following week, Margaret found herself seated at the familiar oak dining table, its surface polished to a shine, as if gleaming perfection could erase the fractures that lived beneath. Claire was visiting, her laptop open and papers spread out across the table. Her daughter's voice carried the confident rhythm of a seasoned attorney, explaining some complex legal case as if Margaret were a colleague instead of her mother. Margaret nodded politely, but her thoughts were far away. The teaching certificate lay hidden upstairs, tucked under a pile of magazines on her nightstand, as if shielding it from Edward's ghost. Her fingers itched to bring it downstairs and lay it right on the table between Claire's stacks of contracts, but she held back. "Mom, are you listening?" Claire's tone had that edge again, half concern, half condescension. "Yes, dear," Margaret said softly, but she knew her voice carried no weight here. For years, this had been the pattern. When Claire was younger, Margaret's words had mattered. She had been the one Claire ran to with scraped knees, with late-night anxieties, with the dreams of becoming a lawyer. Margaret had listened, guided, encouraged. But somewhere along the way, their roles had shifted. Claire, armed with education and ambition, began to see her mother as someone who needed to be managed, much like Edward had. Margaret thought back to that night at Romano's years ago, when she had dared to suggest returning to teaching. How quickly the laughter had come, Edward amused, Claire gently patronizing. "Mom, you've been out too long, it's unrealistic." The sting of their dismissal still lingered, and it wasn't just that night. The pattern had deepened over the years until Margaret had become little more than background noise in her own home. She remembered one Sunday dinner not long before Edward's first heart attack. They had been discussing the upcoming election, and Margaret had offered a thought she'd read in the newspaper about education reform. Edward and Claire had exchanged a glance, a small, fleeting look but sharp enough to slice. Claire had smiled politely, explaining in patient tones why her mother's perspective was simplistic. Edward had nodded in agreement, saying, "Sweetheart, these matters are more layered than you realize." Margaret had fallen silent then, pushing peas around her plate while her husband and daughter carried on as though she were no longer in the room. It was death by 1,000 small cuts. Even vacations had been stripped from her voice. One year she had suggested a trip to Asheville, enticed by the thought of mountain air and cooking classes. Claire had dismissed it without looking up from her case files, and Edward had mumbled something about deadlines. The brochures Margaret had laid on the table had been pushed aside, never spoken of again. Slowly she had stopped suggesting, stopped offering, stopped speaking, because what was the point? Her words only seemed to clutter their conversations, her thoughts treated as quaint interruptions. She had become in her own home a ghost. The worst memory came from Edward's firm's Christmas party. Margaret had dressed carefully that night, wearing the emerald green dress Edward had once said made her eyes shine. She remembered how hopeful she had felt, how eager to belong in his professional world, even just for an evening. But as she passed a hallway alcove, she overheard Edward speaking to colleagues. "The secret to my success is simple," he had said, his voice booming with confidence. "My wife handles the domestic details so I can focus on the important work. She's been a perfect housefrau all these years, keeps the home running, throws dinner parties. Charming in her way, but she wouldn't understand modern business if her life depended on it." The laughter that followed had shattered something inside her. Those men whose wives she had entertained, whose children she had baked birthday cakes for, had chuckled at her expense. Edward had reduced her entire existence to a quaint relic, unfit for real conversation. She remembered standing there in the emerald dress, rooted to the floor, her face hot with shame. When she finally stepped into the room, Edward had slipped seamlessly into charm, wrapping an arm around her waist and dismissing the moment with ease. "Gentlemen, have you seen how lovely she looks tonight?" he had said, as if nothing had happened. The humiliation had been complete, and yet she had said nothing, not then, not afterward. She had gone to the ladies' room, dabbed at her eyes, and returned to smile politely as if her world hadn't just been fractured. That night when she lay in bed, she stared at the ceiling for hours, wondering when exactly she had disappeared. Now sitting across from Claire at the dining table, Margaret felt the weight of those years pressing down on her. Her daughter's voice filled the room, but Margaret barely heard the words. Instead, she studied Claire's face, the determined jawline, the quick eyes, the way she gestured with her hands when making a point. Claire had grown into a remarkable woman, no doubt, but she had also inherited Edward's habit of dismissal. And Margaret realized with a jolt, if she didn't push back now, Claire would continue to see her as irrelevant. Margaret straightened in her chair. "Claire," she interrupted gently. Her daughter looked up, surprised. "Yes, Mom, I've been thinking about returning to teaching," Margaret said. Her voice trembled slightly, but she steadied it. "I still have my certificate. There are programs for adult education at the community college. I believe I could make a difference." The silence stretched. Claire blinked, then gave a small smile, the kind reserved for difficult clients. "Mom, I know you miss teaching. But you've been away for a long time. Things have changed. Technology, methods, it might be overwhelming for you." Margaret inhaled sharply, her fingers tightening on the edge of the table. For a moment the old instinct rose to shrink back, to nod and let the matter drop. But then she remembered Edward's letter, his admission that he had kept her small on purpose. She remembered the humiliation at the Christmas party. She remembered the spark in her own eyes when she rediscovered her journals. "No, Claire," Margaret said, her voice firm. "I think I can handle it. I've managed a household, supported your father's career, raised a daughter who became a lawyer. I'm not as fragile as you think." Her daughter froze, the practiced lawyerly calm slipping for a second. For the first time in years, Margaret felt her words land with weight. She wasn't just background noise anymore. She was speaking, and she intended to keep speaking. The conversation with Claire left Margaret restless for days. It was as if she had pulled open a door that had been sealed shut for decades, and the air rushing through was both frightening and exhilarating. For so long she had accepted her role as quiet support, content to stay in the background while Edward and Claire occupied the spotlight. But now her voice had broken through, and she realized she wanted more of that feeling. Yet the ghosts of humiliation still lingered. One memory in particular replayed in her mind like an old film reel she couldn't shut off: the night of the Christmas party. The Grand Metropolitan Hotel had always felt like stepping into another world. The glittering chandeliers, the marble floors polished to a mirror sheen, the orchestra filling the air with music. Margaret had spent the afternoon preparing, carefully styling her hair, slipping into the emerald dress Edward had given her, hoping that maybe, just maybe, he would look at her with the same admiration he once had when they were young. She had walked beside him, smiling as he greeted colleagues, sipping champagne and pretending the ache in her chest didn't exist. And then, passing through the hallway near the ballroom, she heard his voice. "The secret to my success," Edward had said with the booming certainty of a man who loved an audience, "is simple: a wife who keeps the home running so I can focus on the real work. Margaret has been a wonderful housefrau all these years. She makes a lovely home, throws a fine dinner. But she wouldn't understand modern business if her life depended on it." The word had seared itself into her. Hausfrau. Not wife, not partner, not equal. A relic, a quaint accessory to make him look good in front of other men. And they had laughed at her. Margaret remembered how her throat had tightened, how her vision blurred with humiliation. She had pressed herself against the cool marble wall, praying they wouldn't notice her listening. But one man had noticed: Anthony Vega, Edward's business partner. He had looked uncomfortable, pity flickering in his eyes. That pity had cut almost as deeply as Edward's words. When Margaret finally stepped forward, Edward had switched to charm effortlessly, wrapping an arm around her waist. "Gentlemen, have you seen how lovely she looks tonight?" he had said smoothly. And just like that, the laughter dissolved, replaced with forced smiles and shallow compliments. But Margaret had known. She had excused herself to the restroom, locking the stall and pressing a hand over her mouth to stifle the sobs. She had stared at her reflection, mascara smudged, cheeks burning, and thought, I am nothing but a performance to him. That night had changed something inside her, though she hadn't admitted it at the time. It was the first moment she truly felt erased. Now, months after Edward's death, that memory returned not as shame, but as evidence. Evidence that she had been right all along. She was not weak for feeling invisible. She had been made invisible. Margaret sat on the porch one afternoon, staring at the rows of houses lining her street, each one hiding its own secrets. She thought about all the women she knew over the years, the neighbors, the wives of Edward's colleagues, the mothers at Claire's school. How many of them, she wondered, had been dismissed at their own dinner tables? How many had set aside their ambitions only to be mocked later for having none? The thought unsettled her, but it also sparked something else, a sense of kinship. Perhaps she wasn't alone in this. Perhaps other women carried invisible wounds carefully hidden behind polite smiles. It was during one of those quiet porch reflections that her sister Louise stopped by. Louise arrived with 2 paper cups of coffee and her usual frankness. "You look like you're ready to fight someone," Louise said, handing her a cup. Margaret let out a short laugh. "Maybe I am." "Good," Louise said. "It's about time." Margaret told her about the memory of the Christmas party, about the word Hausfrau, about the humiliation that had never left her. She expected Louise to respond with comfort, but instead her sister leaned forward, eyes blazing. "Maggie, that's not just humiliation, that's oppression. He wanted to keep you small so he could feel big, and he succeeded until now." The words pierced Margaret's heart, but in a way that made her sit straighter. "Until now," she repeated softly. Louise reached across the table, squeezing her hand. "You don't have to carry his version of you anymore. It's gone with him. What's left is your version." That night, Margaret pulled her old journals from the hope chest again. She read her own words from years ago, lesson plans filled with energy, sketches for children's stories she had once dreamed of publishing, reflections on the joy of teaching. She stayed up late into the night, scribbling notes in the margins, her mind buzzing. For the first time in decades, she wasn't simply remembering who she used to be. She was beginning to plan who she wanted to become. Still, doubts whispered. Edward's voice lingered in her memory, scoffing at her unrealistic fantasies. Claire's polite dismissal echoed, reminding her she was out of touch. But another voice, quieter yet stronger, rose to meet them, her own. What if they are wrong? What if I am still capable? Margaret looked at her reflection in the darkened window. For so long she had avoided mirrors, unable to recognize the hollow-eyed woman staring back. But tonight her reflection looked different. There was fire in her eyes again, faint but real. She whispered to the glass as though making a vow, "I will not be small anymore." And for the first time in years she believed it. Winter deepened, bringing with it long nights and quiet mornings that seemed to stretch endlessly. Margaret often woke before dawn, listening to the old grandfather clock ticking in the living room, its chime a reminder of time lost and time yet to claim. The house, once filled with Edward's booming voice and Claire's hurried footsteps, felt cavernous now. Yet in that silence, Margaret began to notice something she had not felt in years: space. Space to think, space to breathe, space to imagine herself outside the role of caretaker and shadow. Still, the weight of invisibility pressed on her. At dinners with Claire, she would try to contribute to conversation, only to be redirected or dismissed. At times, Claire would exchange a glance with Edward's absence, as if his memory alone continued the pattern of judgment. The habits were so ingrained that even without him present, Margaret could feel the echo of his disapproval. It was during one of these quiet dinners that the realization struck her hardest. She had prepared roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and the green beans Claire had always liked. They sat together at the table, but the conversation was one-sided. Claire discussed depositions, legal precedents, and firm politics, never pausing long enough to invite Margaret's thoughts. When Margaret offered a comment about a recent article she had read on education policy, Claire gave a patient smile. "That's interesting, Mom," she said gently, "but the legal implications are much more complex than what the papers report." The words cut sharper than they seemed. It wasn't cruelty, it was dismissal. Margaret recognized the tone. It was the same tone Edward had used for years, a voice that suggested her thoughts were quaint but irrelevant, tolerated rather than valued. Margaret chewed in silence, the taste of her own dinner turning to ash. She realized she had become a ghost at her own table. That night, unable to sleep, she wandered the house. She paused at the doorway of Edward's old study, now eerily tidy without his stacks of blueprints. She remembered how many evenings she had stood there, watching him work, bringing him coffee, asking small questions just to feel included. He had always waved her off, eyes fixed on his drafts. "Not now, sweetheart, too complicated." And she had believed him. For decades she had believed. Margaret lowered herself into Edward's old leather chair, running her fingers along the worn armrests. She felt an odd sense of reclamation. This room had always been his kingdom of ideas and authority. But now he was gone and she was the one sitting here. She leaned back and closed her eyes, whispering to the empty room, "I am not invisible, not anymore." The next morning she decided to test her strength. She called Claire. "Would you like to come for Sunday dinner?" Margaret asked, her voice steady. "Of course, Mom," Claire replied. "What do you want me to bring?" "Nothing," Margaret said firmly. "I'll take care of it." Sunday arrived and Margaret prepared not just a meal but a stage. She set the table with the fine china that had gathered dust, polished the silver, and lit candles. The meal was simple, her famous lasagna. The one Edward had often paraded before his clients, but this time it was not for performance, it was for herself. As they ate, Margaret listened patiently to Claire's stories from the law firm, nodding when appropriate, but then she interrupted. "Claire," she said, her voice calm but deliberate, "do you realize that when I speak you rarely listen?" Claire froze, fork halfway to her mouth. "Mom, what do you mean?" "I mean," Margaret continued, "that for years both you and your father dismissed me, my thoughts, my ideas, my dreams. Even when I suggested going back to teaching. You both laughed at me, did you know that?" Her daughter looked startled. "Mom, I wasn't laughing at you, I just didn't want you to be disappointed." "No," Margaret interrupted, her tone sharper now. "You were laughing at me, and I let it happen. I let both of you make me smaller than I was, but not anymore." The silence was thick. Margaret felt her pulse racing, but she held her daughter's gaze. "Mom," Claire said finally, her voice uncertain. "Why are you bringing this up now?" "Because I've realized something," Margaret replied. She leaned forward, her hands folded firmly on the table. "I am not fragile, I am not irrelevant, and I will not be treated that way any longer." Claire's expression shifted, confusion, discomfort, perhaps even guilt. But for the first time, Margaret didn't back down. She allowed the silence to sit, to do its work. After dinner, when Claire left, Margaret stood at the window watching her daughter's car pull away. She felt both drained and invigorated. Speaking up had not been easy. It felt like dragging her voice out of a cave where it had been buried for years. But she had done it. That night she wrote in one of her old journals. The pen scratched across the page with urgency. "I am not a ghost, I am Margaret Hayes. I once inspired children. I once dreamed of books and stories. I can still dream. I can still inspire. My life is not over. My voice is not gone. This is only the beginning." She closed the journal with trembling hands, but inside she felt steadier than she had in years. The next morning she took another step. She pulled out her laptop, an old machine Claire had once teased her about barely knowing how to use, and began researching adult education programs in the area. Riverside Community College caught her eye. They offered evening literacy classes for adults, many taught by part-time instructors. Margaret's heart pounded as she clicked through the website. Requirements: a valid teaching certificate. Experience in education preferred. Passion for helping adult learners. Her teaching certificate sat upstairs on her nightstand. She had the experience, and passion, she had that in abundance. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, the application page glowing before her. She could almost hear Edward scoffing, Claire sighing in exasperation. But she could also hear the voices of her former students, cheering when she read stories aloud, laughing when she turned lessons into games. Margaret inhaled deeply, then began to type. Name: Margaret Hayes. Position: adult education instructor. Each keystroke felt like reclaiming a piece of herself. When she pressed submit, the confirmation screen appeared. Margaret sat back in Edward's old chair and whispered into the empty study. I'm back. The night before her interview at Riverside Community College, Margaret couldn't sleep. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the steady tick of the grandfather clock in the hall. Every sound seemed amplified: the rustle of wind through the trees, the creak of the old house settling, the thud of her own heartbeat. Doubt whispered in her ear like an old acquaintance. You're too old, you've been away too long, you'll embarrass yourself. But another voice, stronger now than it had been in years, pushed back. You've done harder things. You raised a daughter. You ran a home. You kept everything together while being told you were nothing. If you can survive that, you can survive one interview. By dawn, Margaret was already up, pacing the kitchen with a cup of tea. She had laid out her clothes the night before, a navy blue suit she had bought for Claire's law school graduation but never worn again. She ironed it twice, fussed over the hem, polished her shoes until they gleamed. When she finally drove to the campus, her hands trembled on the steering wheel. The college sat on a wide stretch of land bordered by oak trees, its red brick buildings solid and inviting. Students hurried across the walkways with backpacks slung over their shoulders, their laughter carrying on the crisp March air. Margaret felt both out of place and curiously alive. Inside the Adult Education Center, she was greeted by Dr. Patricia Williams, a woman in her 50s with warm eyes and a brisk handshake. Mrs. Hayes, thank you for coming, Dr. Williams said. I've looked over your credentials. You have years of teaching experience with children, correct? Yes, Margaret replied, her voice steadier than she felt. Second grade. I left when my daughter was young, but teaching was always my calling. Dr. Williams leaned back in her chair, studying her. Adult education is different, of course. These aren't children, they're people who may have carried shame about their literacy for decades. They need patience, encouragement, and someone who believes in them when they don't believe in themselves. Margaret's heart quickened. I know what that feels like, she said softly. To be dismissed, to believe you're less capable than you really are. I want to remind people that their worth isn't measured by who doubted them. It's measured by their courage to keep trying. The words had spilled out before she could stop them, but they hung in the room with undeniable truth. Dr. Williams's eyes softened. I think you may be exactly the kind of teacher we need. The interview lasted nearly an hour. Margaret spoke about her teaching philosophy, her passion for literacy, and her willingness to learn new methods. She admitted she wasn't fluent in modern classroom technology, but she promised she was willing to be trained. Dr. Williams smiled at that. We can teach technology, she said. What we can't teach is heart, and you have that. By the time Margaret walked back to her car, her legs felt weak with relief. She had done it. For the first time in decades. She had walked into a professional room as herself, not as someone's wife, not as someone's mother, but as Margaret Hayes' teacher. 2 days later, the phone call came. Mrs. Hayes, Dr. Williams said, we'd love to have you join our program, part-time to start, evening classes. How soon can you begin? Margaret nearly dropped the phone. As soon as you'll have me, she said, her voice breaking into a smile when she hung up. She sat at the kitchen table with her hands pressed against her face. Tears spilled freely, but this time they weren't the tears of humiliation or grief. They were tears of reclamation. That evening, Claire stopped by. Margaret had debated whether to share the news. But when Claire asked how she'd been spending her time, Margaret looked her daughter squarely in the eye. I've been hired at Riverside Community College, she said. I start teaching adult literacy next week. The silence was heavy. Claire blinked. Mom, what, you're going back to teaching? Yes, Margaret said firmly, and I'm ready. Claire's lips parted as if to protest, but Margaret raised a hand. I know you think it's unrealistic, but the director of the program thinks otherwise. She hired me based on my qualifications, not on your doubts. Her daughter's expression faltered. For once, Margaret didn't rush to soften the blow, she simply let the truth sit. After Claire left, Margaret pulled out her old journals again. She began writing lesson ideas, sketching activities for adults who struggled with reading. She filled page after page, her pen racing across the paper as if making up for all the years she had been silenced. In the days leading up to her first class, Margaret prepared with the diligence of a new recruit. She practiced using the college's online platform, fumbling at first, then gradually gaining confidence. She watched tutorial videos late into the night, laughing at herself when she pressed the wrong button, celebrating when she got it right. The morning of her first class, she stood in front of the mirror. The woman staring back was not the ghost she had once seen. Her shoulders were straighter. Her eyes were alight with nervous energy. She fastened a simple silver necklace, tucked her teaching portfolio into her bag, and whispered, "You've got this." Walking into the classroom, she was greeted by a handful of students. A middle-aged man with calloused hands, a grandmother with kind eyes, a young mother balancing work and night school. Their faces carried the same mix of hope and fear she felt herself. Margaret smiled warmly, setting her bag on the desk. "My name is Margaret Hayes," she began, her voice steady. "I'll be your instructor this semester, and I want you to know something right away. This classroom is a place where you are never too old, never too late, and never too small to learn." As she looked around the room, she saw heads nodding, shoulders loosening. The students leaned forward, ready to try. Margaret felt her chest swell with something she hadn't felt in years: purpose. And as the lesson began, she realized she had not just stepped back into teaching, she had stepped back into herself. The first week at Riverside Community College was a whirlwind. Margaret walked into the classroom every evening with her heart pounding, but by the end of each session, she left with a glow she hadn't felt in decades. Her students were not children, yet in many ways they reminded her of the eager faces she had once taught. There was Rosa, a 58-year-old grandmother who wanted to read to her grandchildren without stumbling over the words. James, a retired veteran in his 70s, who confessed on the first night that he had hidden his illiteracy for decades by memorizing menus and pretending to squint at forms. And Angela, a young mother barely out of her 20s, whose determination to improve her literacy was fueled by the dream of helping her own children with homework. On the second night, Rosa brought Margaret a small paper flower folded from notebook paper. "For you, teacher," she said shyly. Margaret's throat tightened as she accepted it. She set it on her desk, where it remained for the rest of the semester, a symbol of trust given and received. Each class reminded Margaret of why she had loved teaching. The joy wasn't in drills or worksheets, but in the little victories. The moment James read a full paragraph aloud without stumbling. The way Angela's face lit up when she understood a tricky sentence. The tears in Rosa's eyes when she completed her first short story from beginning to end. Margaret threw herself into preparation, spending hours at home crafting lesson plans and watching online tutorials about modern teaching tools. She laughed at herself when she accidentally closed the video call platform 3 times in a row, then clapped in delight when she finally mastered the interactive whiteboard. Every mistake became part of the learning curve, every small success a triumph over Edward's voice in her memory telling her she was too outdated. But outside the classroom, the shadows of her past still lingered. One evening, after a particularly moving class where James had stood up and read aloud for the first time, Margaret returned home to find Claire waiting in her kitchen. Her daughter was flipping through some of the lesson plans Margaret had left on the counter, a crease forming between her brows. "Mom," Claire began cautiously, "I'm worried about you." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Worried? Why?" "Because," Claire set down the papers, "this is a lot. You're pouring yourself into this job like you're 25 again, and you just lost Dad. I think you might be distracting yourself instead of processing your grief." Margaret folded her arms, bracing herself. "And what would you suggest? That I sit in this house and fade into the wallpaper?" "Of course not," Claire said quickly. "But maybe volunteering at the library would be gentler. Less stress, teaching full classes again." "Mom, it's demanding. You could exhaust yourself." Margaret heard the tone she knew so well, the same one Edward had used, protective on the surface, patronizing underneath. She walked slowly to the table, set down her purse, and looked directly at her daughter. "Claire, I'm 67 years old, not 87. And even if I were, I'd still have the right to decide what's too much for me. I am capable. I've already proven it." Claire opened her mouth to respond, but Margaret held up a hand. No, you need to listen. For years, I let you and your father define what I could or could not do. I accepted that I was small, that I was a helper, not a doer. But I'm done accepting that. This class isn't a distraction. It's me reclaiming who I am. The silence that followed was heavy. Claire looked down at her hands, her lawyer's confidence faltering. For the first time in memory, Margaret saw something else in her daughter's face, uncertainty. Mom, Claire said softly, I didn't realize I was doing the same thing Dad did. Margaret's chest tightened, but she didn't let herself soften too quickly. You didn't mean harm, Claire, but harm doesn't always need intention. You learned from him just like I learned to stay quiet, but we don't have to keep repeating it. Claire blinked rapidly, then gave a small nod. She didn't apologize, not yet, but Margaret saw the beginning of recognition in her eyes. That was enough for now. The next week, Margaret received an envelope in the mail from Riverside. Inside was a note from Dr. Williams. Margaret, your students speak highly of you already. Your ability to connect with them is extraordinary. Thank you for choosing to teach with us. Margaret pressed the note to her chest, her eyes filling with tears. It was a validation she hadn't realized she craved, not just that she was capable, but that she was making a difference again. That evening, she called Louise. I feel alive again, she told her sister. Louise chuckled warmly. Of course you do. You're finally living your own life instead of being an extra in someone else's. Margaret smiled, though her heart still ached with unfinished business. She had uncovered Edward's betrayal, reclaimed her voice, and begun building something new. But there was still Claire, still the pattern that needed breaking fully, not just cracked at the edges. And there was still the matter of Edward's finances, the missing money, and Anthony Viga's troubled expression at the funeral. She had the sense that the envelope he had given her was not the only secret he carried. As she hung up the phone and returned to her lesson planning, Margaret whispered to herself, one step at a time. She was no longer a ghost, no longer invisible. She was Margaret Hayes, teacher, mother, and a woman who refused to be silenced again. And for the first time, she allowed herself to imagine not just surviving, but thriving. Spring came to Maplewood Heights with a rush of blossoms and green shoots pushing through the soil. A season of renewal that mirrored Margaret's own quiet transformation. Each week she walked into her classroom at Riverside Community College with a growing sense of confidence. She was no longer the hesitant widow clutching her teaching certificate as proof she mattered. She was an instructor again, standing before eager faces, guiding them step by step toward a future they had thought impossible. But outside the classroom, her journey was still unfinished. Edward's letter lay in her desk drawer at home, the paper worn soft from being read and reread. It contained his confession, his cowardice, and his plea for forgiveness. For weeks, Margaret avoided thinking about it. Forgiveness felt impossible. Yet she knew that the truth it contained was the key to dismantling the lies she had lived under for 4 decades. One evening, after finishing her grading, she sat at the dining table with the letter in front of her. She forced herself to read it once more, each line piercing her like a thorn. I diminished you because I feared you would outgrow me. I convinced myself you needed me when it was I who needed you to stay small. Margaret's hands clenched into fists. She had carried his belittling words for so long, convinced they were truth. But now she saw them for what they were, confessions of a man too afraid to face a strong woman. Anger surged through her veins, but with it came something steadier, clarity. Edward's cruelty was not a reflection of her inadequacy. It was a reflection of his fear. The next day she met with her financial advisor, Margaret Chen, a sharp woman recommended by Louise. They sat in a small office filled with binders and spreadsheets. Elena, Chen said, using Margaret's full name, which felt oddly affirming, you're in a stronger position than you realize. Between the house, Edward's insurance, and your new income, you're secure, but I also want to show you something. She slid a folder across the desk. Inside were documents tracing some of Edward's accounts. Margaret's stomach clenched as she saw the numbers. Transfers, withdrawals, hidden savings she had never known existed. Your husband moved significant amounts into accounts under his name alone, Chen explained. It looks like he was preparing something, possibly even planning to separate finances entirely. Margaret stared at the figures, her pulse quickening. She had known about the apartment and the money spent there, but this suggested something even darker. Edward might have been preparing to leave altogether. Why would he do this? She whispered. Chen's expression softened. Sometimes men who build control over their families, they also build escape routes. It doesn't mean you're ruined, Margaret. In fact, this gives you leverage. You can use what's left to secure your own future on your terms. Margaret left the office with mixed emotions, rage at Edward's selfishness, yes, but also a surprising sense of freedom. The money was no longer a tool to bind her, it was hers now. And she could choose to use it in ways that honored her instead of erasing her. That night she called Louise. He didn't just betray me with another woman, Margaret said bitterly. He betrayed me with numbers on a page. He wanted me small, but he also wanted to disappear. Louise was silent for a moment before answering. Then don't let his betrayal define you. Use it, build something new from it. Take what he meant for control and turn it into power. Margaret thought about that long after the call ended. Could she do it? Could she take the remnants of his lies and build something true? The following week during class, James, the veteran who had struggled most, stood up and read a passage from a book aloud. His voice shook at first, but when he finished, the entire room erupted in applause. James sat down, his face red with emotion, and whispered, "I never thought I'd do that. Never." Margaret blinked back tears. She realized that in helping others find their voices, she was also reclaiming her own. That evening she sat in Edward's old study, the place where she had once been dismissed as irrelevant, and spread out her notes. She began sketching ideas for something bigger than her classroom. What if she could create a program just for women her age, women who had been dismissed, diminished, silenced, a place where they could learn skills, rebuild confidence, and step back into the world? The thought filled her with fire. For decades, Edward had told her she wasn't capable of understanding complex matters. But here she was, dreaming of building an organization that could change lives. Her mind buzzed late into the night, and for the first time in years, Margaret felt that familiar spark of ambition she had buried when Claire was a baby. It wasn't too late, she wasn't too old. The next day she visited her sister again. Over tea at Louise's kitchen table, she shared her idea. Louise listened intently, then smiled. "Do you hear yourself, Maggie? You sound alive. You sound like the woman you used to be, the one who had dreams. Don't you dare let that fire go out again." Margaret nodded, tears stinging her eyes. "I won't, not this time." But even as she spoke, she knew there were more truths waiting to surface. Anthony Viga's troubled face at the funeral haunted her still. He had handed her the key, but his parting words, "I'm sorry for everything," suggested Edward's betrayal went deeper than she had yet uncovered. And she wasn't afraid to find out. For the first time in decades, Margaret was no longer avoiding the truth, she was chasing it. The cafe was quiet on a rainy Tuesday afternoon when Margaret spotted Anthony Viga waiting at a corner table. He looked much as he had at the funeral, impeccably dressed, shoulders tense, eyes shadowed with worry. He rose as she approached, pulling out a chair for her. "Thank you for meeting me," he said, his voice low. "I know this isn't easy." Margaret slid into the chair, folding her hands around the warm coffee cup the server had just placed before her. "You look like you had more to say that day at the cemetery," she said calmly. "I think it's time you told me." Anthony's expression tightened. He glanced toward the window as though debating whether to speak at all. Finally, he opened his leather briefcase and withdrew a stack of folders. "Edward's secrets didn't end with that apartment," he said. "He was involved in things you deserve to know." Margaret braced herself, the weight of dread pressing down again. "What kind of things?" Anthony slid the papers across the table. "Financial records. For the last 3 years, your husband was siphoning money from our firm. Not just small amounts, hundreds of thousands. He redirected client payments, created false accounts, and covered his tracks with alarming skill." Margaret's breath caught. She opened one of the folders, her eyes scanning the columns of figures. There it was again, that name she recognized now, the hidden account. Money moving systematically, month after month. "He was stealing," she whispered. Anthony nodded grimly. $850,000, that's what we tracked before he died. I confronted him about it 2 weeks before his heart attack. I was preparing to involve federal investigators. But then he trailed off, his expression heavy with guilt. Margaret sat back, stunned. She had expected betrayal in love, in trust, even in finances at home. But to think Edward had stolen from his own firm, from the man who had been his partner for years, it made him seem like a stranger all over again. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. Anthony's eyes softened. "Because Edward's death left me with a choice. I could bury his crimes and protect the firm's reputation, or I could tell the truth. I chose a middle road. I reported the theft, and with the help of forensic accountants, we recovered the money. More. Actually, penalties and interest brought it to over $2 million. After restitution to the firm, there's a surplus. Roughly $400,000 belongs to you." Margaret's eyes widened. "To me?" "Yes," Anthony said firmly. "As his widow. Legally, you inherit what remains of his estate, but there's something else you need to know. He wasn't just living a double life with that apartment. He was preparing to disappear entirely. offshore accounts, transfer trails. If he hadn't died when he did, he might have vanished, leaving you and Claire with nothing. Margaret gripped the edge of the table, her stomach twisting. The betrayal felt endless, as though Edward's lies were a bottomless pit she kept falling into. I don't know what to say, she murmured. Say this, Anthony replied gently, that you'll use the truth to build something better than the lies he left behind. Margaret stared down at the papers. A thought began to form, fragile but insistent. She had already considered creating a program for women like her, women who had been diminished, silenced, left behind. What if Edward's stolen money became the seed for that vision? She lifted her gaze, meeting Anthony's steady eyes. If I take this money, I don't want it for myself alone. I want to use it to help women rebuild their lives. Women who were told they were too old, too fragile, too small. I want to turn Edward's betrayal into something that heals. For the first time, Anthony smiled. I hoped you'd say that. They spent hours at the cafe, sketching ideas on napkins, talking through possibilities. A nonprofit center for women over 50. Classes in financial literacy, job training, emotional support, partnerships with community colleges. Margaret's pen moved furiously as she wrote notes, her mind sparking with ideas faster than she could capture them. By the time the rain had stopped and the cafe was closing, Margaret felt a new kind of exhaustion, an energized exhaustion, the kind that comes from pouring yourself into something that matters. That night she returned home and spread the papers across Edward's old desk. But this time she didn't feel like an intruder in his kingdom. She felt like she was reclaiming it. The next morning she met Louise for breakfast. She slid the papers across the table, explaining everything. Louise listened, then leaned back, shaking her head in amazement. He tried to erase you, Maggie. But now you're taking what he left and turning it into a beacon for others. That's more powerful than any revenge. Margaret smiled faintly. It's not revenge, it's redemption, not for him, for me, and for every woman who's ever been silenced. The weeks that followed were filled with planning. Meetings with lawyers, conversations with Dr. Williams at Riverside, brainstorming sessions with Anthony. Slowly the vision took shape. The Alina Hayes Center for Women's Advancement. A place where women could come to learn, to heal, to start over. Margaret threw herself into the work with a fervor she hadn't felt since her 20s. She stayed up late drafting proposals, met with potential donors, and spoke with women who shared their stories of dismissal and invisibility. Every story fueled her determination. One evening, as she packed up papers, Claire arrived unannounced. Margaret braced herself. "Mom, what is all this?" Claire asked, gesturing to the stacks of documents and notes spread across the dining table. Margaret looked her daughter in the eye. "This," she said steadily, "is the beginning of something new. A center for women like me, women who have been overlooked, underestimated. I'm using the money your father left behind to build it." Claire stared stunned. "Mom, are you serious?" "Yes," Margaret said. "For the first time in decades, I am absolutely serious. For once." Claire had no ready argument. She looked at her mother with something Margaret hadn't seen in years: respect. And in that silence, Margaret felt a shift. The power dynamic that had kept her small for so long was crumbling. She was no longer the woman who needed permission. She was the woman making decisions. Margaret had always thought starting something new at her age would feel impossible. Yet as the weeks passed, she discovered an energy she hadn't felt since her youth. Every morning, she sat at the kitchen table with her journals, bank documents, and a growing stack of notes about the center. The papers, once used to represent Edward's control, now symbolized her liberation. She named it the Margaret Hayes Center for Women's Renewal, though Anthony insisted she use her full name. "Claim it," he told her. "For 40 years you lived under Edward's shadow. Let this be yours." At first she resisted. The thought of her name on brochures, websites, and legal documents felt overwhelming. But one evening, while reviewing the proposed mission statement, she whispered aloud, "This is mine." The words sent a shiver through her. She signed the paperwork the next day. The early steps were small but monumental. She worked with Anthony to open a separate account for the center, deliberately keeping it apart from the estate lawyers managing Edward's assets. She scheduled her first meeting with Dr. Williams, who enthusiastically agreed to partner with Riverside Community College to provide classroom space. She even began reaching out to women she knew from church and the neighborhood. Quiet conversations over tea where one after another admitted they too had felt invisible. "Sometimes I feel like I don't exist anymore," confessed Marjorie, a widow from down the street. "My children treat me like I'm fragile glass, but inside I'm still me." "You are," Margaret assured her, "and we're going to make sure the world remembers it." Each story she heard reinforced her conviction. This wasn't just her fight, it was theirs too, but not everyone understood. Claire arrived one evening carrying a manila folder, her lawyerly face set in that serious, professional expression. Margaret knew the look well. It was the same one Edward had used before dismissing her opinions. "Mom," Claire began carefully, placing the folder on the table. "I've been speaking with some colleagues. They're concerned about you." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Concerned about me or about the fact that I'm not sitting quietly anymore?" "Both," Claire admitted. She opened the folder, revealing articles about grief counseling, notes on elder care, even brochures for assisted living communities. "Mom, this sudden career change, the secrecy about finances, your obsession with starting a nonprofit, these could all be signs of avoiding reality. I just want you to be safe." Margaret felt her chest tighten. It was Edward's voice all over again, now echoing through her daughter. But this time she would not shrink. She rose slowly, crossed the room, and returned with a box she had prepared for weeks. Setting it firmly on the table, she met Claire's eyes. "Before you lecture me on my mental health," she said evenly, "you need to see the truth about your father." She opened the box and one by one laid out the evidence. Edward's confession letter, the bank statements showing transfers, the photographs from the secret apartment, the receipts that proved years of deception. Claire's confident expression faltered. She picked up the letter, her lips moving silently as she read. Margaret watched her daughter's face shift from disbelief to shock to something like grief. This can't be real," Claire whispered. "Dad wouldn't. He loved us. He controlled us," Margaret corrected softly. "He convinced me I was too small to have dreams, and he taught you to dismiss me too. But he knew exactly what he was doing. Every look, every word. Every time he called me irrelevant, it was deliberate." Claire's hands trembled as she set the papers down. "I didn't know, Mom. I thought I was helping. I thought I was protecting you." "I know," Margaret said gently, "but protection is not the same as respect, and now that you know, you have a choice. You can keep treating me like I'm fragile, or you can start seeing me as the woman I am." For once, Claire had no argument. She sat in silence, staring at the table, her world unraveling just as Margaret's had months before. The power shift was unmistakable. For decades, Margaret had been the one seeking approval, hoping for validation. Now Claire was the one confronted with evidence, forced to reevaluate everything she thought she knew. After Claire left that night, Margaret sat quietly in the living room, the box still open beside her. The silence was heavy, but it wasn't oppressive. It was full of possibility. She picked up her phone and called Anthony. "It's time," she said simply. "Time for what?" he asked. "To launch the center," Margaret replied. "Not just ideas on paper. I want our first program ready within 3 months." Anthony hesitated. "That's ambitious." "So am I," Margaret said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "I lost decades to silence. I won't waste another year." The weeks that followed were a blur of activity. She and Anthony secured a small office downtown, furnished with second-hand desks and chairs donated by the college. Dr. Williams offered part-time faculty volunteers to help with training sessions. Louise rallied her church friends, who baked goods and held fundraisers to support the opening. Margaret found herself juggling lesson planning at Riverside with nonprofit paperwork late into the night. She was exhausted, yes, but it was the sweet exhaustion of purpose. Sometimes when doubt crept in, she looked at the brass key she now wore as a pendant around her neck. Once it had unlocked Edward's betrayal. Now it reminded her of her own strength. One afternoon, as she stood in the empty office space that would soon house the center, sunlight streaming through the dusty windows, she felt a wave of emotion wash over her. For so long this had been unthinkable. A dream buried under years of being told she was nothing more than a helper. Yet here she stood, 67 years old, a widow. A survivor, about to open doors for women who had been silenced just like her. She whispered aloud, her voice steady, "This is where it begins." And in that moment, Margaret knew that Edward's shadow no longer defined her. She had stepped fully into her own light. The launch of the Margaret Hayes Center for Women's Renewal came faster than anyone expected. The modest office space was transformed with fresh paint, donated bookshelves, and a circle of mismatched but sturdy chairs that gave the room a feeling of warmth rather than sterility. Margaret had chosen soft yellow for the walls, a color she remembered from her childhood classroom, a color that spoke of welcome, of possibility. On opening night, the air buzzed with nervous energy. A dozen women gathered, their faces reflecting every stage of life. Some had silver hair and lines carved deeply by years of sacrifice, others were younger, weary from battles that had little to do with age but everything to do with being dismissed. Margaret stood at the front, her palms sweating but her heart steady. "Thank you for coming," she began. Her voice trembled, then grew stronger. "This center exists because for too long, many of us have been told we're too old, too fragile, too unprepared for the modern world. I believed that about myself once. But I was wrong. We are never too old to grow, to learn, to lead." The room was silent for a beat, then filled with nods, murmurs, even a few tears. Margaret continued, sharing pieces of her story, not the deepest betrayals, but enough to let them know she understood. She told them about leaving teaching to raise her daughter, about the years of invisibility, about rediscovering her strength at Riverside. "You are not invisible," she said, her voice firm now. "You are not done. This is a place to remember who you are and who you still can be." Applause erupted. For the first time, Margaret felt the truth of her mission settle deep into her bones. The weeks that followed were full of moments that reminded her why she had fought so hard for this. There was Evelyn, who had left her job at 40 to care for her ailing parents and now, at 65, wanted to re-enter the workforce. There was Linda, a woman who whispered on the first day, "I've never even had a bank account in my own name." And there was Gloria, 70 and sharp as ever, who wanted to learn computer skills so she could finally write the memoir she'd been dreaming about. Each story mirrored Margaret's in some way. Each woman carried scars of being dismissed or diminished, and each found in the center a place where those scars could begin to heal. But not everyone celebrated Margaret's transformation. One Sunday evening, Claire arrived with her usual briskness, carrying her laptop and a frown. Margaret had just finished grading papers for Riverside when her daughter walked in. "Mom, we need to talk," Claire said, placing her laptop on the dining table. Margaret sighed. "Go ahead. This nonprofit, this center, it's growing fast. I know you mean well, but you're taking on too much. Financially, legally, you're making decisions that could put you at risk." Margaret folded her hands. "I've consulted with attorneys, with financial advisors. I'm not walking into this blind." Claire's tone softened, but the edge of patronization lingered. "Mom, I'm an attorney. This is my field. You don't have the experience. What if someone sues you? What if funding dries up? What if—" Margaret raised a hand. "Claire, stop." Her daughter blinked. "For decades, your father convinced me I wasn't capable, and I let him. But I will not let you carry that torch. I am capable, I am learning, and I will make mistakes, yes, but they will be mine to make." The words hung between them electric. Claire closed her laptop slowly, clearly unsettled. "Where is all this coming from?" she asked quietly. Margaret looked at her with steady eyes. "It's not coming from anywhere new. It's always been here. I just stopped asking permission to be myself." For once, Claire had no argument. She left that night quieter than usual, and Margaret sensed the ground between them shifting. It was uncomfortable but necessary. Meanwhile, the center blossomed. Local newspapers wrote small articles praising its mission. Donations trickled in enough to fund computers and supplies. Women began recommending it to friends, and soon the circle of chairs expanded into 2 classrooms. Margaret worked tirelessly, teaching at Riverside in the evenings and running workshops at the center during the day. She was exhausted, but every morning she woke with a sense of purpose that carried her through. One afternoon, during a financial literacy workshop, Linda raised her hand timidly. "Mrs. Hayes," she said, "I opened my own bank account this morning, my first one." The room broke into applause, and Linda's face glowed with pride. Margaret felt her chest swell. These were the victories Edward had never imagined for her, the kind of triumphs she had once thought beyond her reach. Later that week, as she locked up the center for the night, she stood in the doorway watching the lamplight spill across the rows of chairs. She thought about the woman she had been a year ago, sitting at Edward's funeral, clutching an envelope with shaking hands, believing her life was over. Now, here she was, not just surviving, but leading. She touched the brass key pendant at her neck. The key that had once opened the door to Edward's betrayal now symbolized the door she had opened for herself and for others. But Margaret knew her journey was not over. Claire's resistance was only part of it. The legacy of Edward's lies still loomed, particularly the darker truths Anthony had revealed about the embezzlement. She couldn't help but wonder what else might surface. Yet for the first time in her life, she didn't feel afraid of the truth. She felt ready. As she turned off the lights and stepped into the night, Margaret whispered to herself, "I'm not finished, not yet." And the words felt less like defiance and more like destiny. 6 months after its opening, the Margaret Hayes Center was no longer just an idea scribbled in a journal. It was a living, breathing community. The once empty office now hummed with energy. the clatter of keyboards in the computer lab, the murmur of women reading aloud to one another, the bursts of laughter during workshops when someone finally conquered a skill they had once feared. Margaret often arrived early, unlocking the doors as the sun lifted over Maplewood Heights. She loved those quiet moments before the rooms filled, when she could walk through the space and remember what it meant, that Edward's attempts to keep her small had given rise to something larger than she could have imagined. On the wall near the entrance hung a framed mission statement: "We are never too old, never too late, and never too small to learn again." Margaret had written those words herself. Every time she passed them, she felt a spark of pride. The center's first graduating group, a dozen women who had completed 6 months of classes in financial literacy, computer skills, and confidence training, was preparing for a small ceremony. Margaret watched them rehearse their speeches, her heart swelling with admiration. Evelyn, who had once wept that she'd been out of the game too long, now stood tall, ready to re-enter the workforce. Gloria was drafting chapters of her memoir on a laptop she had learned to navigate at the center. Linda carried her new checkbook with confidence, no longer relying on her son to manage her money. The ripple effect was real, yet amid the joy, a reckoning still loomed. Claire, though beginning to soften, had not fully embraced Margaret's transformation. She attended the center's events reluctantly, clapping politely but always with that furrowed brow that seemed to say, "Is this really sustainable?" Margaret noticed the way her daughter lingered at the back of the room, uncomfortable in a space where her mother was no longer dependent. And then came the evening Margaret had both dreaded and anticipated, the confrontation. Claire invited her to dinner at an upscale restaurant downtown, one they had once frequented with Edward. The candlelight, the soft hum of conversation, the smell of roasted garlic, it all carried ghosts. Margaret straightened her shoulders, determined not to let old memories unsettle her. "Mom," Claire began after the waiter left, "I've been thinking a lot about everything, about Dad, about you, about the center." Margaret folded her napkin neatly, waiting. Claire's eyes glistened in the low light. "I need to apologize. I didn't just doubt you. I tried to control you the same way Dad did, and I see now how wrong that was." Margaret's throat tightened. She had longed to hear those words. Yet part of her braced against them. Apologies were easy, change was harder. "I appreciate that," she said carefully. "But Claire, I need you to understand, this can't be about protecting me anymore. It has to be about respecting me." Claire nodded quickly. "I know, and I want to, but it's hard to unlearn what I grew up seeing." Margaret reached across the table, her hand steady. "Then let's learn together. I'm not asking for perfection, Claire, just for honesty. And for you to see me as I am, not as who Dad told you I was." Tears welled in her daughter's eyes. For a long time they sat in silence, hands clasped, as though decades of distance were slowly closing. But Margaret knew the conversation was bigger than just the two of them. It was about generations of women learning or failing to see their worth. The next week she incorporated that theme into a workshop at the center. She stood before a group of women, some seated with their daughters beside them, and said, "Our daughters watch us. They learn not just what we teach them, but how we live. If we let ourselves be diminished, they learn to accept diminishment as normal. If we rise, they learn to rise with us." One woman raised her hand, her voice trembling. "But what if it's too late? What if my daughter already sees me as small?" Margaret smiled gently. "Then you show her, not by words alone, but by action. You show her you are capable, and she will have no choice but to see you differently." She thought of Claire as she said it, and her voice grew steadier. "It's never too late to rewrite the story, not just for ourselves, but for those who come after us." The women nodded, some wiping tears, some squeezing their daughters' hands. Margaret felt the weight of Edward's ghost slipping further from her shoulders. Yet just when she thought the past had loosened its grip, Anthony Vega appeared at her door one afternoon holding another file. "Margaret," he said quietly, "I promised I would tell you everything. There's more." Her stomach tightened. She had thought the worst was behind her, but Anthony's grave expression told her otherwise. He laid the documents on her desk. Edward's offshore accounts, they weren't just about hiding money. He was planning a complete exit, new identity, new life. He was weeks away from leaving you, Claire, and even the other woman, Carmen. He was going to disappear entirely. Margaret's breath caught. "Leave everything?" Anthony nodded. "Yes, and it means this. He didn't just diminish you, Margaret. He planned to abandon you, to erase you entirely." The words struck like a blow, but Margaret steadied herself. She pressed a hand to the brass key pendant at her neck. Once this kind of revelation would have destroyed her, now it only fueled her fire. "Then let his memory disappear," she said firmly, "because I'm building something that will last longer than any of his lies." Anthony exhaled, relief softening his features. "I knew you'd say that evening." Margaret stood before her class at Riverside, her heart burning with clarity. She looked at the faces of her students, women, men, young, old, all of them fighting their own invisible battles. "You've all been told at some point that you couldn't," she said. "But here you are proving every day that you can, and that is how we win, not by erasing the past but by refusing to let it define us." As they applauded, Margaret realized she had already won. Not against Edward, not against the years of silence, but against the belief that she was small, and that victory was hers alone. 1 year after Edward's funeral, Margaret stood in front of her intermediate literacy class at Riverside Community College. The classroom was flooded with morning light, every desk occupied, every face bent over an exam paper. The sound of pens scratching across pages filled the room like music. Margaret moved between the rows, her heart swelling with quiet pride. There was James, the veteran who had once hidden his illiteracy in shame, now reading confidently to his grandchildren. Rosa, the grandmother who used to hand Margaret paper flowers, now writing her own short stories. Angela, the young mother, planning to apply for college herself next semester. As she paused by a window, Margaret touched the pendant around her neck. The brass key, once the symbol of betrayal, had been reshaped by a local artisan into a necklace. Where it used to unlock Edward's hidden apartment, it now represented the door she had opened for herself. Her eyes drifted to the framed photograph on her desk. Margaret, Anthony Vega, and 22 women cutting the ribbon at the opening of the Margaret Hayes Center for Women's Renewal. Their faces shone with joy, with possibility, with proof that life did not end at 50, 60, or even 70. When the exam ended, the students filed out one by one, thanking her, smiling shyly, promising to return next semester. Margaret sat at her desk afterward, her hand resting on the brass key. For so many years she had believed she was invisible, small, irrelevant. Now she carried living evidence that she had never been any of those things. Later that week, the center hosted its first graduation ceremony. The small auditorium was filled with families, children, grandchildren, spouses, watching proudly as women they had underestimated walked across the stage. Evelyn, once timid and unsure, now accepted her certificate with tears streaming down her cheeks. Gloria Reed allowed the opening paragraph of her memoir to thunderous applause. Linda held her head high, waving her new checkbook like a trophy. When it was Margaret's turn to speak, she stepped to the podium, her hands steady on the wood. She looked out at the crowd, her daughter seated in the front row, her sister beaming from the side, Anthony watching with quiet support. "I used to think my story ended when my husband died," Margaret began. "I thought I was too old, too broken, too invisible to start again. But I learned something powerful. Our stories don't end until we decide they do. Each of you sitting here today has proven the same. You are not defined by who doubted you or who silenced you or who told you your time had passed. You are defined by your courage to begin again." The audience erupted in applause. Margaret's chest tightened with emotion, but she stood tall, letting the sound wash over her like a benediction. After the ceremony, Claire approached her holding a bouquet of white roses, Margaret's favorite. For a moment, her daughter looked uncertain, as if unsure how to step into this new relationship. "Mom," Claire said softly, "I'm proud of you. Not just for what you've built, but for teaching me something I should have known all along. That strength doesn't disappear with age. And that respect is not optional. I want to be better at being your daughter." Margaret's eyes filled, but she didn't rush to comfort her daughter as she once might have. Instead, she nodded and said simply, "Then let's start from here, as equals." They embraced, not as caretaker and dependent, not as controller and controlled, but as two women learning to respect one another anew. Weeks later, Margaret was invited to speak at a regional education conference. Standing before hundreds of teachers and advocates, she told her story openly, about the years of silence, about the lies she uncovered, about the transformation that followed. She spoke not with bitterness but with clarity, turning her pain into a lesson. "The beautiful thing about starting over," she told the crowd, "is that you don't start from nothing. You start from everything you've lived through, every mistake, every loss, every scar. It all becomes part of the foundation for what comes next." The audience rose in a standing ovation. Margaret's hands trembled, but not from fear. They trembled from the sheer force of knowing she had finally become who she was always meant to be. That evening, she returned home to her quiet apartment, filled with books, photographs, and art she had chosen herself. No shadows lingered, no lies pressed against her chest. She poured herself a glass of tea, sat by the window, and looked out at the city skyline Edward had once claimed as his legacy. But now Margaret knew the truth. His buildings might stand tall, but her true legacy was living and breathing in classrooms, in the center, in the lives of women who had reclaimed themselves. She closed her eyes, whispering into the stillness, "I am not invisible, I never was. and for the first time in her life she felt whole. Margaret Hayes's journey began in the shadow of her husband's betrayal. For 43 years she had lived as the dutiful wife, supporting Edward's career and raising their daughter while silencing her own ambitions. At his funeral, a mysterious envelope exposed not only his secret double life, but also the decades of control and dismissal that had left her invisible in her own home. The revelations shattered Margaret, yet they also ignited something long buried. Piece by piece, she reclaimed her identity. She pulled out her old teaching certificates, applied for a position at Riverside Community College, and stepped back into the classroom after more than 2 decades. There she rediscovered her voice through the victories of her students, adults who, like her, had been told it was too late. But Margaret's transformation didn't end in the classroom. With the help of Anthony Vega, Edward's former business partner, she uncovered the financial deception that had nearly destroyed their lives. Instead of letting bitterness consume her, Margaret used the restitution money to found the Margaret Hayes Center for Women's Renewal. Her mission: to give women over 50 the tools to rebuild their confidence, their financial independence, and their dreams. The center flourished. Women who had once been dismissed as irrelevant learned new skills, found new careers, and reclaimed their worth. Margaret's own daughter, Claire, slowly came to recognize the strength she had overlooked in her mother, and their relationship began to heal on a foundation of equality rather than control. By the end, Margaret's story was no longer about betrayal, but about liberation. She proved that starting over is not about erasing the past, it is about transforming it. Her legacy was not Edward's buildings, but the lives she touched, the voices she restored, and the fire she rekindled in herself and others.